Hello everyone, can you hear me? Fantastic. Have you spent the week pinching yourself, just thinking how amazing it is to be in Cambridge? Last year I had probably one of the most awesome experiences of my life when I spoke in the Australian Parliament in Canberra. I was incredibly nervous, but I just thought, for goodness sake, a rural girl speaking in our parliament. But I think today is probably just as exciting. Churchill is outside. It's amazing, isn't it? Now, have you all had a fantastic week? Yes. Great. Okay, well, I'm going to try and upset some of you. I'm going to try really hard. Now, if you're like me, you're also at that stage, if any of you are my age, and as Kathy said, I'm heading towards 60, but where you spend all day with the glasses because you put them on and you can't see, you take them off and you can't see. You do all this sort of stuff all day, and then the reason you can't see out of them because the hair product is all over the lens, yeah? So I'm going to give it a go. So we'll see how we go. So what I want to start by saying that not only am I speaking in Cambridge today, which is just awesome, but isn't it wonderful to be introduced by somebody who you hold dear as both a friend and a colleague. So I want to really thank Kathy for her amazingly warm words. As Kathy said, my name is Amanda Kenny and I'm the Violet Marshman Professor of Rural Health. And I'm going to tell you more about that as we go on. I spend much of my time in communities as a researcher, health professional, and I'm the director on the board of management of a health service. In my spare time, I am a mother of 4 gorgeous kids, and they're all grown up. I'm incredibly proud of them, so they range in age from 35 down to 25, and they're just the most awesome individuals. And I think I just feel so privileged and so lucky. I'm also, much more importantly, the mother of dash hounds, so my 2 very spoilt princess dogs. And from when the children were little, they were really clear about where they sat in the pecking order in terms of who was more important. I do travel a lot, and when I travel, I used to always ring the kids, and the first question I would ask is, how are the girls? And they know I'm not referring to my daughter, I'm talking to my dogs. Yes, Mum, they're fine and we're okay too. I am a grandmother to beautiful Evie, and you'll meet her at the end of my presentation. I'm a friend, I'm a gardener, and as Kathy said, I am an intrepid traveller. I'm also an apple worshipper, and I don't mean the fruit. So I believe very much in social justice, so it's really weird, isn't it, that I worship at the chapel of one of the largest corporations in the world. But, when Steve was talking about digital natives and people who come to technology later, I'm totally addicted to technology. And so I'm often sitting, in a meeting and it's dead quiet, and Minnie on my wrist will say, hello, it's 2:15, and everyone will look at me, but I do love Apple. I believe that lectures of this type should generate discussion, emotion and disquiet. Whilst the wonderful Kathy Lassiter, a great colleague of mine, so elegantly described herself as being pragmatically provocative. What a great term. And I thought that went really well with the elegance that is Kathy Lassiter. I think many people would describe me at best as disruptive, and at worst, an Australian rat bag. And I'm going to talk a lot about rat bags during my talk. So I'm just going to flick this first slide on, and you get to meet my 2 rat bag dash hounds. So in my talk, I think the world is full of dichotomies. And the biggest dichotomies are found in healthcare, and that's what I want to talk about today. We work in healthcare systems and we educate health professionals around the world, doesn't matter which country you are in, for a system that I argue is 40 or 50 years past its use-by date. We have this massive gulf or chasm between many opposing opposites. These opposites create enormous stress and frustrations, but sometimes create the most fabulous opportunities. This photo is very old. It was taken in the 1850s, so I'm sorry that the quality is not great. But I want to tell you about my home, and hopefully by the end of the presentation, you will see how this all knits together, from my dash hounds to my beautiful home. I'm incredibly fortunate to live in the spectacularly beautiful goldfields city of Bendigo, Victoria, Australia. As Kathy said, I'm about an hour and 20 minutes from the city of Melbourne. And in many ways, I think Bendigo is just like Cambridge. It's about the same distance that Cambridge is from London. And if you walk around the streets of my beautiful home, it is, and I guess I'm biased, but it is one of the most spectacularly beautiful places in the world. Bendigo is a city full of opposites. So there are so many dichotomies that exist within my home. In the 1850s, women were pious, delicate and fragile. But in a scrubby creek in 1851, Mrs. Margaret Kennedy and Mrs. Julia Farrell found gold and sparked the world's greatest gold rush. And that happened about 5 minutes walk from my beautiful home. In Christmas 1851, there were 800 people panning in the dusty creeks around my home. And by June 1852, 20,000 diggers from around the world in a 6-month period arrived to seek their fortune on the Victorian goldfields. And it makes me shiver, and it brings incredible pride to me when I think about this beautiful home that I have. But how awesome that 2 women found gold. You know, when Victorian women were dressed in sort of very over-the-top frocks and expect to be so demure, there were 2 women panning in the creek in 1851, and they sparked the world's greatest gold rush. Between 1850 and 1900, more gold was found in Bendigo than anywhere in the world. That's the beautiful city that I live in now, and for those of you in England, you will see some of the beautiful Victorian architecture. And I'm going to tell you about our dragon in a minute, because that's one of the greatest dichotomies. So the beautiful city that I live in was literally built on gold. And it transformed from a dirty collection of mining tents. At the height of the gold rush, there were about 60,000 miners in tents in the land that I call home. It transformed from a tent city to the most amazing Victorian architecture. And in my city lives the longest Chinese imperial dragon in the world, and you can see Sun Lung up there. At Easter, and this is sort of the weirdest bit of it, at Easter each year, Sun Lung the dragon parades through the streets of our city, and weirdly he's piped through the streets by a Scottish Highland band. Now, it is the weirdest thing out. So you've got the pipers with their bagpipes, and following behind you've got a dragon. And the history of it's fascinating. So the English hated the Chinese, the Scots hated the English, so the Scots and the Chinese became really good friends on the goldfields. And interestingly enough, that tradition still exists. So at Easter each year, the dragon parades through our city, led by bagpipes. It is totally insane. And the reason it's totally insane, because they let off something like 1 million crackers. So you've got a dragon, bagpipes, screaming children who are terrified. And then in the middle of it all, in the middle of the city in which I live, there's a big park. And there are, people call them bats, but they're more like flying fox. And of course, when you let off 1 million crackers in a city, you can imagine what the bats do. So it's got this sense of Gotham City with bats flying madly, a dragon, bagpipes and screaming children. So it's really, really absolutely mad. And if you ever get time to visit Bendigo, please let me know and come and visit us. I'm going to tell you about my grandmother, and hopefully this will, as I said, all knit together. My grandmother, a few generations back, Henrietta Harriet Heywood, what a great name, was born in London on the 7th of February 1826. On the 12th of June 1843, she stood as a fresh-faced, brown-haired, hazel-eyed 17-year-old, and where she stood was in the dock of London's Central Criminal Court, or the Old Bailey. One's imagination could run totally wild with thoughts of a young domestic servant racing through the streets of London after stealing an umbrella, snuff boxes, cigars, pipes, bowls, and a pound of tobacco. In a system where respectable women were demure with virtues of morality and domesticity, she was given the harshest penalty. Now, I want you to stop for a moment and just think about a young 17-year-old poor English woman of that period. She grew up in one of the most notorious streets in London. I've been there and visited. There's a railway station there now, which is in Clerkenwell, Turnmill Street. And if you Google that, it was the centre of depravity in Victorian times. So as a 17-year-old English woman, she was transported to the hellhole of Van Diemen's Land. And on Christmas Day, 1843, she was led to the Cascade factory in Hobart Town. Now, can you imagine for all of those women, and men of course, but were transported for petty crimes and sent? You know, it took me 24 hours to get here, but these men and women were thrown into ships, into hulls, and they were transported across the seas. In any country in the world, we would be embarrassed to talk about our relatives as convicts. But in Australia, we feel incredibly proud. It brings tears to my eyes because I think I come from the stock of awesome women, you know, that have been transported across to the other side of the world. And I just look at my children and I can't imagine, my daughter's 30. But if you have a 17-year-old, do you imagine your daughter being thrown on a convict ship and sent to Antarctica and dumped? That's what it was like. The most amazing thing about my grandmother is less than a decade later, my undisciplined, wild and unruly grandmother had found her fortunes on the Bendigo goldfields. So she went from a servant who had stolen tobacco in London to an incredibly rich woman. And her fortunes changed purely within a decade. I just think, how lucky am I and how awesome is that? I want to talk to you now about the woman whose title I hold. Violet Vines Marshman trained as a nurse, but was an exceptionally canny businesswoman. 10 years before her death, in 2014, Violet established the V.V. Marshman Charitable Trust to help improve the health and well-being of vulnerable rural people. The Trust have generously provided millions of dollars to the research program that I lead, and I really humbly carry Violet's name so proudly. I feel incredibly privileged to live in a city where 1851 women were not pious but sat panning for gold in the creeks. My family history is full of disruptive women who were once transported as convicts but made the most fabulous fortune in an era where men dominated. I hear the title of Violet Marshman, and I bear that title, a woman described by her sons as strong, passionate and disruptive. The most awesome thing about Violet, and she's right over here on the end, the most fantastic thing that her sons told me about her, they said that the reason they believed she set up a trust was so she could continue to annoy them from the grave. You know, they're both older men now. The three brothers are older now. They're all retired, so they're probably heading toward their 70s. But they said when their mother died, it was something like $14 million, and she was a nurse. that she had accrued through really smart business. And they said that Vi, they call her, that her role in setting up the trust was, to make her sons talk to each other, and so she could make their lives difficult. So they've been fantastic. They've generously, they fund my position, and they've given me, or given my university a large philanthropic donation, which is quite unusual in Australia, not like the US, particularly where there are a number of philanthropic chairs. Okay, I will come back to health shortly. When you look at synonyms for disruptive, the superlatives include troublemaking and troublesome. I quite like to be thought of as troublesome, as true change can only occur when people put up their hands and be totally annoying. In the late 1970s, I'm going to talk about Dame Edna. For those of you that don't know Dame Edna, this is the wonderful Barry Humphries, who is one of Australia's, I think, most famous comedians. Of course, the Brits claim him. He spent a lot of time, particularly in the 60s, but he has a number of alter egos, and my favourite is Dame Edna. He really sort of makes the whole sort of cross-dressing a new art, doesn't he? He's fantastic. So in the late 1970s, a wonderful book was published called Rat Bags, and I'm going to talk about rat bags. Oh, Minnie's telling me what time it is. And I love the link between disruptors and rat bags. Whilst the term rat bag does exist within the Queen's English, it is most commonly used in a colloquial way in Australia to describe someone who is eccentric, wild, and slightly dangerous. I like to think of those gold-panning women in the creeks in Bendigo, Margaret and Julia, my grandmother Henrietta, the young servant girl who ended up making a fortune on Victoria's goldfields, and Violet Marshman, whose title I hold as disruptive rat bags. I think for their age, they were. In the foreword to the rat bag book, the very wonderful Barry Humphries, up here as Dame Edna Everidge wrote, and I quote, and I want you to really concentrate on this because I'm going to encourage you all to be rat bags. A rat bag is anyone that dares to be different. A rat bag is the creature who creates a pinnacle, perhaps only tiny, above the great drear of conformity. Most of us see a million eyes focused on us, waiting for us to make one move out of the norm. So we sit there figuratively sucking our thumbs and conform. He goes on to say that the whole system, and I think this is so true, has been designed to impress on us the importance of conformity. There was the school uniform we all wore, the mass education system with every child chanting the same mathematical tables, learning about the same English kings, largely, often not queens, and sitting by the thousand in the same public buildings, sitting the same matriculation papers. What I like from the writings of Humphries is the idea of non-conformity, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about healthcare. The idea that a rat bag or a disruptor is not disrupting for disruption's sake, but rather, without disruption, we will continue to accept the status quo. In this presentation, what's left of it, I plan to be a rat bag disruptor by arguing that at best the health system and health education need major disruption. To me, it is clear that major disruption is needed before the whole system implodes. I'm trying to temper my pessimism. I am the eternal optimist. But as each day passes, we lose the chance for mere disruption and move closer to the need for a cataclysmic, large-scale upheaval. We must disrupt the health system. Health systems in most countries, as I said at the start, were designed for a very different world and now are more than 40 or 50 years out of date. I want to take you back to the 1940s when the NHS was set up. I want to take you back to the 1950s and the 1960s when the health systems in many countries were established in the form that they are now. Why we would even begin to think that these systems meet contemporary need is totally beyond me. If we watch the news service of most countries in the world, it is clear that these systems are not sustainable, and at some point there will be a major health system breakdown. When I arrived into London, on the news they were talking about the hundreds of thousands, millions of older people that will actually, and we're all going to be part of that will age into a system that is struggling now. Health systems around the world are full of people who shouldn't be in hospital, and it's only going to get worse. And I think the problem that I have is most of us know the problems. I'm not telling you anything new, but we sit there and we moan about it and we say, yeah, but we do very little about it. I think there will be a catalytic implosion of the health system unless we see a major disruption. I think every one of us must loudly demand an urgent move from an outdated acute system to massive funding injection into primary and social care. Health systems around the world do a great job if you are acutely ill. You wouldn't want to be in any other place. Or if you suffer major trauma. But if you are poor, not well educated, old, mentally ill, or you have complex and chronic conditions or a disability, or live in a rural area anywhere in the world, your experience of the health system is usually substandard. I often tell the story of a woman that I encountered in my research. So I work a lot with communities, and I went out to a very small community about 2 hours from where I live. And this woman was really well educated. She was a school teacher, she had a master's degree, she had quite a large family. But she told me this horrendous story about how one night her husband came home on a Friday night and she described him as totally crazy. Now, I think for most of us would describe our husbands as totally crazy. But she said he came home, he was really agitated, he was wanting to renovate the house, he was wanting to take the kids on a camping trip, and she said he came home and she thought that he must have taken drugs or something. She said he was just totally mad. Anyway, long story, but he took off fishing with a mate, and about 2 days later his wife received a call to say that he'd been admitted to one of the regional psychiatric centres about 2 hours from their home. Now, what was really sort of amazing about this story was that he knew there was something wrong with him, and he told his wife he was going fishing, but what he wanted to do was to get a mate to drive him 2 hours away from home because he was frightened. He knew there was something seriously wrong with him mentally, and he was really worried how that might impact on his family. He spent 4 months as an involuntary patient in a psychiatric centre, and his wife and children visited him often. His wife told me how a few months after he had been admitted, she received a phone call to come and get him. And her description was that he was thrown out on the street with his suitcase and she was told he was ready to go home. She said that she asked, what happens now? They'd had no experience with mental illness in their family at all. The story is really bad, and I can probably say it here. She might be a bit identifiable at home, but she had 7 children, and her youngest child had Down syndrome. So she picked him up and went home, and she said it was really clear on the drive on the way home that he was still not well. She was told just to visit the GP. She went to the general practitioner and she said the GP did a great job of managing his medications, but said, actually, I know nothing about mental illness. So she used her resources, she got on the telephone, she phoned service after service after service, and she was basically sent from one service to another. She said she eventually got onto a service that said they could help, but they were recruiting and they would phone her back when they recruited somebody with expertise in mental illness. She said a year later she was still waiting for that phone call. I was sitting in her lounge room and I'm just sitting there chatting to her, and she said to me, every night I go to bed, I look at that knife block. And she said, I really wonder whether I should lock it away. And then she said, I think that even if I did that, if he really melts down at all, that would not save me and the children. This was a woman who really, I can only say, was totally let down by a system that failed to care. I was in Nottingham last week and they were telling me that the majority of people in their hospital shouldn't have been there. They do not require acute care. They needed primary and social care. Many of them were like that woman who really, needed care from a health system, but needed a care from a health system that is contemporary, that addresses the issues and the complexity of today's living, not living in the 1940s. The idea that the health service at Nottingham, a very big health service, should be 90% full of people who shouldn't be there, we could all think, oh, really? But I would argue that that situation is not just Nottingham. It's every single hospital around the world in whatever country you happen to live. We know there is a problem, but we let the problem continue. It is a travesty that many people in the world can't attend a GP when they need to. How much you pay for care depends on where you live. Funding models are not designed to encourage allied health and nursing expertise. If you have a complex or chronic condition in any country in the world, when Kathy introduced me, she said that I have visited 58 countries. I have spent an enormous amount of time in health services and universities around the world. And I would argue that in every single country, integrated and comprehensive care is almost non-existent. Much of the data that we make policy and funding decisions on is either absent, it's poor quality, or it's one-dimensional. Decision-making is often driven by assumptions that people's needs are the same and that they are the same across geographically diverse areas. As I walk through the health service in Nottingham, I might as well have been in the health service in Melbourne or the health service in Chicago. They are big, technologically complex buildings full of largely people who are poor, old, and vulnerable. Our decision-making about our health system is designed for a simpler world and much less complicated times. The enormous cost of living in metropolitan cities around the world, and if you look in the real estate windows, even in Cambridge, or I have in London, it means that our most vulnerable are being pushed out into communities at a great distance to where the really core services are. In my country, they're being pushed out into small rural communities. So we have the sickest people at the greatest distance from the services that they need. An older woman who, again, I met in my research. People in rural communities are just beautiful. I often go out and I'll go and speak to this woman. And, she told me after I'd spoken to her, I went to do an hour interview with her. I was there for 6 hours. She was so desperate for someone to talk to. And when I left, she asked me to pop the bonnet and the boot, and her lovely husband bought me out pumpkins and kale and cauliflowers and filled it with vegetables from their garden. They were so excited to have someone to talk to. She told me that her roof had been pummeled by stones, by local kids. She told me that her son, who walked the streets of their town talking to himself, was viewed as a monster, and that she had been screamed at in the supermarket by people saying, "Keep your pedophile son away from my children." Stigma was rife in that community, but they could no longer afford to live in a large city because we keep building these great big hospitals instead of investing properly in social care. Health outcomes and life expectancy, I'm incredibly embarrassed to be standing here as an Australian. Our life expectancy for our Indigenous people is a travesty. I have New Zealand colleagues here, and all I can say is they do so much better than us, but even in New Zealand, it is problematic. When I talk to my fantastic Canadian colleagues, they talk about the appalling differences in life expectancy between Indigenous people in their countries. I think we are seeing exactly the same travesty around the world when we look at the healthcare and the distances that we're going to see in life expectancy about for people who are refugees. And I think when I stand here and talk about the appalling difference in life expectancy for Indigenous people in my country, I also want you to look at the statistics about the differences in life expectancy for every person with serious and enduring mental illness in every country in the world. You know, we live in wealthy, privileged countries. Why would we have a 30 or 40-year difference in life expectancy for Indigenous people, for people with serious mental illness, and I think in the future for refugees? This is shameful and should not be tolerated in wealthy countries around the world. In the Australian context, it is a disgrace that more than 50% of little kids start school where they have holes in their teeth, cavities. Now, you could say that this is not happening in your countries, wherever you live in the world, but I spend an enormous amount of my time as a researcher looking at statistics and epidemiology from around the world, and I can tell you that your statistics are exactly the same. I spent time with the Flying Doctors and their great school dental service. So most of you may have seen the Flying Doctors on television, this lovely romanticised view. There is also a branch of the Flying Doctors where they go out to provide dental care for children in communities. And I had all of these little kids coming up to me, bragging and wanting me to look at their amazing shiny teeth. What they were talking about was fillings in their teeth. These are kids this big. I had one little tot tell me about how brave she'd been, that she'd had 4 anaesthetics to have dental work. She was 6. If you are sitting there falling back into conformity, you might be sitting thinking that your own system is much, much better. I can tell you it isn't. We may be pouring billions in to patch an outdated acute system, but our outcomes are not improving. We are all going to live longer, but we are going to live longer with chronic disease. This means we will have complex and debilitating chronic conditions that a system is not set up to manage now, and we haven't seen the wave of the baby boomers yet, and we haven't seen our generation that will be living so much longer. The evidence shows us that most people around the world want to live at home as they age. But the primary healthcare systems and the social care systems have suffered from benign neglect as we've become more and more obsessed with bigger and bigger hospitals and more technology. I was reading on the way over in a newspaper, and they were saying that almost £3 million pounds a year, which is almost just under $1 billion Australian dollars, is spent in the NHS each year because there are people who are trapped in hospitals taking up beds because there is no system for them to be discharged to. We must disrupt the concept of person-centred care. And for all of you who teach students around person-centred care, I'm being very provocative in saying that. I would argue that in most countries in the world, the health system is beyond renovation. We need serious disruption. The whole system needs pulling down and rebuilding, and it needs rebuilding supervised by those who actually use the system, not us. It needs to be people who experience that system every single day. Well-meaning people who live very comfortable lives can have no understanding of what it is like to be vulnerable and desperate to access even basic services. The real experts who should be central to the rebuilding primary care are those trying to navigate the system. Our response to harnessing their expertise is largely focused on the tokenistic consumer on an advisory committee. The term co-design is now being thrown around as the latest buzzword. We're all saying we're co-designing with people who use services. But as someone so eloquently put it on Twitter in the last few days, co-design is not locking 3 people in a room as token consumers with butcher's paper or sticky notes. Co-design is not tokenistic consultation that gives no power to people to make decisions. Co-design is not spending hours and hours dumbing down information and evidence into lay summaries so that ordinary people can understand. In our work, we have seen some amazing outcomes when people are given complex information about their communities and are empowered to prioritise what they need in their communities. When we worked in a community about how to improve oral health outcomes in that community, there were no unrealistic demands for dental services. They explored the data, really complex data that we gave them. They were fascinated by it. They were really interested in what might have worked in other communities. So we provided them with case studies of what does the evidence say about what has worked to improve oral health outcomes with children in other communities. They developed toothbrushing programs, and from the local hospital workshop, they developed a toothbrush holder for the school. And the community explored dry toothbrushing programs and the evidence around that, as there were no sinks in the schools. The point I think that I'm making is that we do talk about service user perspective. We say we do this really well, but I would argue in most cases it's still tokenistic. I find the use of the term person-centred care incredibly annoying. Whilst we continue to think about the person at the centre of care, there is still the crowded group of health professionals who sit as experts, with the person in the centre. We must disrupt our thinking and seriously involve people who use health services in the design, delivery and evaluation of health services and health care. And it needs to be a two-way process. In my research, we had a really interesting experience a little while ago, and I've told this story before, but we were doing, and people sort of say, oh, that would never work in my context, but we brought together a group of people with serious mental illness and a group of health professionals and got them to explore their experiences of the health system together. Now, the health professionals engaged in what theoretically you call defensive reasoning. They were all very protective, they were bunkering down, that wouldn't happen here, but that happens because I've got a terrible manager or there's no money. And then you've got the consumers being really argumentative and really difficult. And you just think for a moment, you think, oh my God, what have I created? And there was this sort of really one of those just lovely golden nugget moments when one of the consumers was complaining and making comments about how awful it was that nurses hold people down in psychiatric facilities. So what he was talking about was restraint and how awful that was. The mental health nurse looked up, young guy, and he said, well, when that happens, I go home and I get no sleep. He said, I lie in bed with tears in my eyes, because he said the impact of having to hold somebody down is just awful. The mental health consumer looked and said, oh my God, I'd never ever thought that you might feel like that. So it was a really hard and complex group to work with. But the amazing stuff that happens when they really share humanity. They didn't become a person with serious mental illness or a health professional in their silos, but they came together and became very human in their discussion. And I think it drives me mad when we throw away this term person-centred care all of the time, but we still mean the person's at the centre and we'll tell them what to do. Navigating a complicated health system is for many people an insurmountable challenge. Healthcare systems around the world are far from seamless. I don't know about you, but I have 5 degrees and a PhD, and when I'm sick or my children are sick, it does my head in. Can you imagine, do you find navigating the health system easy? I find it shocking. Can you imagine if you were 85, you speak no English and you're old? The problem is when we talk about service user involvement, how often do we engage 85-year-old people who are old and don't speak English? Not very often. I had a recent personal experience with my gorgeous friend Sue. Sue is a nurse practitioner in mental health, so she's really highly skilled. She has a PhD, and the very beautiful Sue, her mum Margaret, has dementia. So Ma and Pa lived about 5 years ago. Grandpa died, and none of the family had realised that Margaret had dementia. He had covered for her. And so every time Margaret made some sort of crazy comment at family functions, Grandpa would say, "Margaret, that's enough wine." But the day Grandpa died, Sue found that, Ma was wandering, she was going to the toilet in cupboards, she was really at risk, and nobody had realised. So Sue didn't know what she was going to do, so she brought Margaret back to live in their home. And Sue, like a great health professional, got on the phone to find some sort of dementia program for Margaret, because Margaret was in their home and Sue needed to work because she needed to support her family. So she phoned a number of services, and as soon as she said that her mum had dementia, they basically said, "Look, I'm sorry, we can't help you at all." So these are day services. So Sue finally got on, there's a bit of a funny angle to this, Sue finally got onto a dementia program, and she said, "I'm looking for somewhere for my mum during the day, I need to work." And also, her mum's one of these disruptive, amazing women. She was a school principal, and at 80, her and Max had an Order of Australia for services to rugby. He still played rugby at 80. And at I think they were about 80 or something, when Margaret, in her tweed skirt and her handbag, walked across Cradle Mountain for a week. So they were very fit up until that point. So Sue finally got onto a dementia service. She said to the woman on the dementia service, "Oh, that's fantastic, you take people with dementia." And the woman said, "Yes, it's a service for dementia." And Sue said, "That's great, can I book Mum in?" And the woman on the phone said, "Does she wander?" And Sue said, "Yes, she wanders, she's got dementia." And the woman said, "Oh no, sorry, we couldn't have any wandering people in our dementia program." Now, what happened with that is that Sue desperately persevered, but in the end, the only suggestion that people could make was perhaps Sue should get some counselling because she appeared to be not coping. The end of that story is that Sue's mum very soon after went into care, and that care tore their family apart because one side of the family said to Sue, "You're being awful, how can you do this to our mother?" But they weren't offering to help. Now, the situation in that, again, is the fact that the members of that family no longer speak. If there could have been some great social care, Ma would still be at home in Sue's house. But basically, you've got a nurse practitioner with a PhD who's incredibly articulate, incredibly intelligent, and she can't get help for her mum. We must disrupt the way that we educate health professionals. If you spend a bit of time on Google, you will find a different use of synonyms for disruption. You'll find the word innovation, inventive, ingenious, and unprecedented. Innovation to me, again, like person-centred care, is one of the most annoying words in the English language. I better warn you about that because I'm a journal editor, and every time I see the word innovation, it drives me nuts. And the reason it does, because everyone describes what they do as innovative. And I hear the term constantly in relation to healthcare education. Now, if you play the synonym game on Google with the term innovation, it means revolution, upheaval, and transformation. When you describe your work as innovative, and I want you to sit there for a minute and think about it, is it about revolution? Is it about upheaval? Well, it might be, because you might upset all your colleagues. Is it really about transformation? Or are you simply socialised into believing that what you do is innovative because it's the way that you have always done things? People often say to me when I talk about wild innovation, we couldn't do that here, our system's different, or you don't understand. Provocatively, I think that is about defensive reasoning. I think we're all fearful of being seen as a rat bag, because rat bags and disruptors can often be seen as difficult, and they make people feel very uncomfortable. There's also, I think, a very real fear that if we do disrupt, it will impact on your career prospects. As a nurse and midwife, I'm incredibly privileged, as I said, to visit universities in countries all over the world. And again, perhaps provocatively, I would argue, and I want you to seriously have a think about this, that I see in university after university exactly the same program that I was educated with over 40 years ago. We talk about it being amazingly innovative and amazingly different. It's exactly the same way that I was educated, and I am almost 60. I think that we are caught in a complex dichotomy. We feel like we need to educate people for the outdated acute healthcare system that we have, and we can't change our educational models because we continue to perpetuate the outdated system, but at some point we need to majorly disrupt both. In all major countries around the world, and Kathy talked about that in her presentation, the percentage of nurses working in the community is woefully inadequate. We have millions and millions of people in the UK, Australia, Canada, US, Scandinavia, they do it a little bit better, but everywhere in the world. Yet we have, in many of these countries, less than 10% of nurses working in the community. It is totally crazy. I seriously could teach my 12-year-old to operate an IMED pump. But what happens is we bring students into our programs and we seduce them in with all of the excitement of acute care. But that's not the reality of the health system anymore. In my own discipline of nursing, the majority of time is spent preparing students for acute hospitals. Little time is spent, like Kathy's talked, about primary care and teaching them the key skills of health coaching, self-management, encouraging people. I think that legislative barriers, outdated funding models, and our own professional turf wars stifle innovation. It drives me nuts. If we break down all health professional education, and this is a little bit radical, I know, but if we break down all health professional education, there are core competencies that all health professionals need. You know, it drives me nuts in my own country. It's about universities making money about being distinctive and different. We should have a national curricula in Australia. You should have one in the UK. It's about universities wanting to position themselves as being innovative and different rather than what we should be looking at, the end point, which is quality healthcare for vulnerable people that live in our communities. I just don't get the term nursing research and nursing leadership. I don't get it when we enrol students in nursing research subjects. Like, what in hell does that mean? Surely it's health research. It's the same sort of research that happens with medicos, that happens with physios. At least I had a great week last week when I met some incredibly disruptive academics in a disruptive university in the UK. And it was fabulous to talk to them about their programs where over 50% of the curricula is common. Oh my God, half a course to physios, OTs, nurses, social workers is exactly the same. And you know why it's the same? Because it's the same core competencies. But instead, we set up program after program. Can you imagine around the world if we collected all the money that's spent on developing up new programs and actually put that into universities? Can you imagine your workloads might be a wee bit less? It's just crazy. Now, the radical disruptors in the UK, I was really excited by them because what they're talking about is actually a core curricula with bolt-on competencies so I could graduate and register as a nurse and an occupational therapist. Dual qualified. How amazing would that be? Can you imagine how valuable that would be in many communities around the world, whether metropolitan or rural? But we continue to teach these damn programs that were the same as what I was taught under. In my own research, very excitingly, we submitted a $1 million large funding submission yesterday for a co-design model where we're going to work with community members to design a new model of oral health care using pharmacists. People go, what? People visit a pharmacy in Australia 14 times a year. They can't get to see dentists. So what we're going to do is we're train the pharmacists to do oral health care. The Australian Dental Association at first went, whoa. But we're going to do it as a co-design model so we can actually deal with all of that legislative turf wars. But, you know, it's sensible. We've got pharmacists in all these communities. Why wouldn't we train them to do oral health care? I believe, oh, you like this one. I believe that we need to toss out the concept of interprofessional education. What a load of garbage it is. In my own university, we have a core first year. So I'm an 18-year-old and I have enrolled in a Bachelor of Nursing, and I'm an 18-year-old and I'm enrolled in a Bachelor of Physiotherapy, and I'm an 18-year-old enrolled in a Bachelor of Occupational Therapy. And we tell them about this amazing interprofessional first year. So we throw them in a room and we expect, just because they're enrolled in those degrees, that they'll start functioning like interprofessional future health professionals. What a total load of nonsense, seriously. You know, just because a student's enrolled in a course, why do we think that we'll turn them into fully functional interprofessional creatures? It's quite nuts. We must disrupt the way we think about educational research. As an editor, I read thousands of papers a year. Most are beautifully written, but many end up being rejected. And the reason they end up being rejected is because what we are doing is duplicating studies over and over and over again. We have massive amounts of literature that's never cited, that nobody ever reads, yet what do? We write more and more and more, and why do we do it? We do it because it's about the line on our CV. It's about keeping our bosses happy to say, I've published 6 articles this year. Rather than thinking, does the research that we're writing, do the publications we're writing make a difference to the vulnerable people at the end of care? So I think we need to totally think about research in a different way. Rarely do we think about the impact of our research, and few of us would build in integrated knowledge translation right from the beginning. By this, I mean the translation of our findings directly into policy, practice, education immediately. I think most of us don't think about impact. Oh my God, how in hell do you write those ref statements? You have to make it up because we don't think about it when we're designing studies. We just keep writing more and more articles. I rarely see any consideration given to how educational innovation will lead to improved client or consumer outcomes. In all of the beautiful presentations, and I am being provocative, that I have sat through this week, I've been dying to ask one question. Hey, how will this make a difference to patient outcomes? And I reckon if I had have asked that question, most people wouldn't have been able to answer it. So we're not designing studies in thinking about that. I heard this week somebody told me that it's really hard to get funding for educational research, but if we could link our research to client quality and safety, the funding would be another story, I think. But I think we still do educational research where we talk about we want to share our amazing innovation, but we don't talk about how that amazing innovation is going to make a difference to vulnerable people. We must disrupt or there will be no leaders of the future. I actually think I put the wrong one in there. I want to look at that one. I was thinking about disruptors. Of course, the suffragettes. I love the sign, a fearless, indomitable womanhood, and almost saying that we're fearless. Look at them. This is, in the 1920s. And I just think, when you think about disruptive women, I think about this group of women. So my final disruptor is about us and our roles. I will finish soon. In my own discipline of nursing, we had this totally crazy mantra. It drives me mad. What we say to our youngest and brightest when they finish their undergraduate programs, we say to them, go out and get some experience, and once you've got some experience, come back and do your postgrad. And then what do we do at that point? We say, go back and get some more experience and come back in a few years and do a PhD. Normal, sensible disciplines anywhere around the world do not do that. So what happens is we lose those youngest and brightest, and by the time they do their PhDs, like many people in this room, they're 50. They're moving to the end of our career. They are not amazing leaders at that point because we're going to lose them. One of our Deputy Vice-Chancellors is 38 years of age. She's a scientist. She's been a professor for quite a few years now. She's 38. She did sensibly her PhD when she finished her undergraduate degree. She did her degree, her honours, and then went on to a PhD. I think we actually need to rethink the whole thing, and we need to develop models where, particularly in my own discipline of nursing, they can start doctoral studies at 23, but we need to be able to develop models where they can actually work in practice while they're doing their PhDs. They need to be graduating from their PhDs at 25 so they can be leaders of the future, not leaders at 58 when you're ready to retire. If you look around the room here, I can see a couple of young women, and I know a couple of them. My colleague Gemma Stacey up there, who's a young woman, who will be one of the UK's leaders of the future. But most of you, if you're not my age, you're moving toward that. Where are the young people? How come we're not bringing them on? And I actually really believe that the key to leadership roles is doctoral presentation, whether a clinician or an academic or those great people who span both. Unless we aspire to strategically escape the treadmill of massive teaching loads and even more administration, and I think at a conference like this, I think all of you are really falling under these massive teaching loads. And what I see in my own university is they become bitter, twisted and burnt out people. If you look on Twitter, around the world, there's been a lot of discussion about mental health amongst academics. And I believe strongly, it's because we don't have amazing mentors. I believe strongly that success in higher education is 50% strategy and 50% hard work. But if you are a junior lecturer anywhere in the world, you can't see your way out of these massive teaching loads. You can't see how your career will ever progress because you're completely overwhelmed. But if you think about, if we prepared students straight from undergraduate degrees with PhDs, we'd be immediately setting them up in a different way to be leaders of the future and not to be overwhelmed, and particularly if we gave them great mentors who could help them be incredibly strategic. I was a lecturer with a huge teaching load, with massive amounts of marking. But I was one of the really lucky ones that I had the most amazing mentor who took me by the hand and told me exactly what I needed to do. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to find mentors. Not one, lots of them. And we have to actually work out ways to strategically I'm going to finish in 1 minute, but as women, we need to stop behaving like small girls who suffer from major imposter syndrome. For most of my career, I've waited for someone to tap me on the shoulder as a major imposter. We need to be proudly ambitious and not apologise for it. Rarely do you ever hear a man accused of being difficult or being ambitious. Rarely. We have to demand to be paid properly, and we should aim to the highest levels of promotion as women. You know, my colleague, and a wonderful colleague in OT who's applied for promotion to associate professor, she said to me just before I left, "I'll be really happy if I get to associate professor." I said, "Stop it. We're going to now work on your promotion to full professor." She said, No, I'm not after power or glory." I said, "It's not power or glory, it's being paid properly." And I said, "And the second thing is you tell me that you are passionate about making a difference. The professor title, boy, does it open doors. Could I have gone to speak to the Health Minister of Australia as a lecturer? No, I couldn't. Could I as a professor? Absolutely." So I think we have to stop this girl behaviour. We have to think about career planning. And we have to be really, really, really push. And particularly the young women, bring them along. That's why I've got the suffragettes up there. That's my feminist rant. Okay, as I finish, I want to bring you back to disruptive ratbags. You might not feel you have the voice to totally disrupt an outdated health system, but you do have the capacity to be a bit of a ratbag. If my grandmother can board a ship from England in the 1800s as a servant girl, and she can make a fortune on the Victorian goldfields, then all of you can be slightly ratbaggish. You can be the creature who creates a pinnacle, perhaps only tiny, above the great drear of conformity. I want you to go home thinking about the number of pinnacles that could be created if we were all a bit disruptively ratbaggish. So if we all, when somebody says you can't do this here, or you can't do it in the UK because we have the new standards, oh my God, I've heard that constantly since I've been here. Who do you think can change those standards? If we are all slightly ratbaggish and we become politically, and we bring up all these young women and our students to be politically active, standards change by people saying, no, that will not work, or no, we think this is a better way to do it. So you can be the creature who creates a pinnacle, perhaps only tiny, above the great drear of conformity. And as I said, I want you to go home thinking about the number of pinnacles that could be created if we were all a little bit disruptively ratbaggish, and if we all behaved like my grandmother as a servant girl who made a fortune. If I have unsettled you or annoyed you, or you vehemently disagree with me, I'll go home really happy. That's because I'm an Australian ratbag. I live in a city founded by women who refuse to be pious, delicate and fragile. I come from a long line of disruptive women who refuse to be demure, moral and domesticised. One of the worst things that happened in my career, and I'm going to just tell you this story, I've never told a whole audience this because I was always too frightened. But it's amazing how when you get old, you can say all these things because you think, oh, if you want to sack me, that might be good. You might pay me out. Please don't anybody tell my Vice-Chancellor I said that. But, you know, I was a young academic. I was 30. I did my PhD with one of Australia's leading health economists, a fantastic man. He was dean of the faculty in which I worked. I had a head of school who was a male. I walked through to get myself a coffee this day. I was about 30. And my boss, the head of school, a man, there were a whole group of men in suits, and as I walked past, I said hello and realised the Vice-Chancellor was there, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, the Deans of Faculties, all blokes. And I just said hello, and my boss said very loudly, oh, you all know Mandy, do you? She finished her PhD really quickly because she slept with her supervisor. Now, that was said to me as a young academic, a 30-year-old. I just almost melted into the ground. So I went straight back and I sat in my office and I rang my supervisor and I said, oh my God, you'll never know what's happened. I'm so embarrassed. Apart from anything, his wife was lovely. And, you know, I just felt, I thought you would never have said this to a man, but I sat and cried. And he just said to me, if you want to report him, do it. But I was too frightened to say anything because I was really frightened that my academic career would be over. But what I did do was I went and spoke to my boss, who, by the way, hated my guts for the rest of my career because I ended up much more senior than him. But I went back to him and I said, I was really embarrassed by what you said, but I phoned the Dean, my supervisor, and the Vice-Chancellor and just let them know what you'd said. And he just went sort of pale for a moment, like he thought he was being funny. You know, so I think that, you know, what we need to do is we need to, particularly women, we need to be disruptive. I like to think those women, you know, as I said, sitting in the goldfields, my grandmother and the woman whose title I hold, the Violet Marshman Professor of Rural Health, her sons would probably be incredibly upset. I'll email them and tell them. But I like to think they were really ratbag disruptors. Probably, you know, none of us would like to think about our sort of very elegant mothers as ratbags, but I do think that idea of Barry Humphries as people who just make that little bit of disruption as a little pinnacle above conformity. What I'm going to do, my last thing I'm going to do is show you, if I can go back. These are my family of disruptors. So, can you see the family resemblance? I didn't realise it until today. So the woman over there or the little girl standing on the Victorian steps is my grandmother Lydia. The middle one is my mother Rosie. That, of course, is me. And you could tell I was a disruptor because I just think the politically incorrect doll that's in my pram. My beautiful daughter Lydia, who would be incredibly embarrassed because Lydia is model material. She's a stunning looking 30-year-old, but she's being disruptive then. And of course, my beautiful granddaughter Evie, who's sitting there. So what I want to do as I finish, I want to thank you so much for listening. And what I want to do is set you all a challenge. Send me an email. Tell me the slightly ratbaggish thing that you have done in your own university. Because it might only be something tiny. It might only be something, do we need to look at our curricula? Do we need to stop telling bright young undergrads to go and work for 10 years before they do a PhD? It might be that you want to actually become politically active and you want to write to politicians about the appalling state of social care and primary health in your own countries. But yeah, do something slightly ratbaggish and let me know how it goes. My email address is there and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Questions, but I'm sure you'll be around for a wee while, right?
Oh, have I gone way over time? There you go. So, I'm happy to have discussions with... Sorry?
Can I have a couple of questions?
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. I'll be quick with the answers. Has anyone got any quick questions?
That's only one question now.
No, that's fine.
As a fellow Dachshund lover, I have 3. I'd like to know how that relates back to your picture of your Dachshunds, please. Oh, you said you'd come back to it,
and the reason
it's
is,
important.
My Daxies, Juno and Luna. If you're a Dachshund, if you're a Dachshund lover, you'll know they're incredibly disruptive. Yeah. So that was the link back to my Dachshunds. They don't think they're dogs; they think they're princesses. Yeah. Any other quick questions? Have I stunned you all into silence? That'd be great. I'll talk to you. I'll be wandering around. Great. Thank you so much.